Luffy just killed Bonnie. He's holding Zoro and Sanji by the neck with his rubber arms. No air, no screams. His eyes are red. Dark threads are crawling out of his skin. And he's smiling, because that's not Luffy anymore. That's the demon Imu planted inside his body to destroy the Straw Hats from the inside. And this Luffy is not the one you know. This Luffy copies his crew's techniques in seconds. He throws Zoro's Tatsumaki back faster than the original. He launches Sanji's Diablo Jambe in the cook's exact voice. And he unleashes a haki so dark that the most feared giants of the Blue Sea drop to their knees, unable to move. In the next few minutes, you're going to see the first mate shatter Wado Ichimonji against a rock just to attack his own captain. You're going to see Nami on her knees while the same fist that saved her in Arlong Park comes flying straight at her face. You're going to see Loki sent 2 kilometers backwards by a single finger, and Jinbei taking a hit no human should ever survive. But that's not the heaviest part. The heaviest part is what Imu whispers inside Luffy's head about Ace, about Sabo, and about every single one of his Nakama, because none of them joined the crew by chance. Every single one was planted there 800 years ago. And there's something even worse. One of the Straw Hats carries a bloodline secret that forces him to kill the Pirate King, and he doesn't even know it yet. And the last sentence Imu leaves hanging in the air before he disappears is going to change One Piece forever. Your mother is coming for you. Stick around until the end, because what happens when the Straw Hats have to decide whether to kill their own captain, you won't see it coming. The sky above Elbaf had turned red like an open wound, and the clouds spiraled around something no giant dared to name. At the center of that storm floated Luffy, but he was no longer Luffy, because red threads sprouted from his skin and one eye glowed with demonic light. His hands had stretched down to the ground, and they held Zoro and Sanji up in the air, both hanging by the neck, with no strength, no screams, no time. Below, on the green grass stained with dust, Nami was kneeling with her hands over her mouth, choking back a scream she had been holding inside for minutes. The giants of Elbaf, the most feared warriors of the Blue Sea, watched from afar without daring to move because their bodies would not respond to their will. Loki, the cursed prince, tried to drag himself toward the center with his broken arms, but the air around the Pirate King had already stopped being air. And then the demon wearing Luffy's face smiled with that twisted Nika grin and began to tighten his fists around the 2 necks. But to understand how the freest light of the New World became the darkest shadow, we have to go back 3 days to a calm sea. 3 days earlier, the Thousand Sunny sailed calmly along the outer coasts of Elbaf, and Luffy was sitting on the figurehead with a faraway look. Bonnie reached him by climbing over the railing, chewing on something, and sat down beside him without asking, because for weeks now she hadn't needed permission. She asked him why he was so quiet, and Luffy answered that he had dreamed of Joy Boy that morning, but that the dream had felt very strange. Joy Boy had said only one word to him, one that sounded warm and familiar, but inside that dream the word had sounded like an urgent warning. Luffy didn't tell Bonnie the word, not because he wanted to keep it to himself, but because every time he tried to say it out loud, the sea wind swallowed it. Bonnie laughed and told him that dreams weren't real, but inside she felt a chill, because her father Kuma had told her similar things before. At that very moment, far away, in the forbidden palace of Pangaea Castle, a shadow was rising from a throne where it had sat for 800 years. Imu walked for the first time in centuries toward a forgotten balcony, looked at the horizon to the west, and smiled with a mouth almost no one had ever seen. He whispered Luffy's name in a tone that mixed ancient hatred with sick tenderness, and sent for a messenger who flew toward Elbaf at once. That same night, the Straw Hats made the same oath in Elbaf that they had made at the Baratie years ago, with a barrel in the middle of them all. Luffy put his foot up first and shouted to the night sky that he was going to be the king of the pirates, and the giants heard him from their distant villages. Zoro stepped on the barrel in silence, looked at the moon, and said quietly that he was going to be the world's strongest swordsman, with no doubt, no fear, no mercy. Sanji rested his leg on the wood and promised to find the all blue before he died, and lit a new cigarette to seal that renewed promise. Nami, Usopp, Chopper, Robin, Frankie, Brook, and Jinbe stepped up one by one, each with their dreams intact, each with fear hidden behind their smile. And then Luffy turned his head and saw Bonnie sitting far away, alone against a rock, looking at the barrel with a sadness she thought she had hidden well. He shouted for her to come over, told her she had a dream too, and that night in Elbaf, no one was going to be left out of stepping on the sacred barrel. Bonnie walked trembling over to the group, put her foot on the old wood, and whispered that all she wanted was to see her dad Kuma smile again. No one laughed. No one spoke. Only the wind of Elbaf answered, moving the flames of the torches as if the whole world had heard that wish. What none of them knew was that that oath, made under the red moon of Elbaf, was going to seal the fate of the youngest pirate of the crew. At the dawn of the second day, the sky over Elbaf darkened for no reason, and a world government messenger landed in front of the Straw Hats' camp. The messenger carried a black envelope sealed with the mark of the void and handed it to Luffy in silence, not daring to look at him, trembling all over. Luffy opened it, read the few words inside, and for the first time in a long time, his smile vanished completely from his young face. The message said only one sentence, written in red ink. "The king behind the kings awaits you in the sky of Elbaf. Come alone, without your crew." Zoro snatched the paper from his hands, read it, and told him it was an obvious trap, that no sane captain would accept an invitation that deadly. But Luffy had already tucked the paper into his pocket and was looking at the sky with that look his Nakama knew well. That look that meant yes. Robin, who understood the ancient words better than anyone, told him that the king behind the kings was a name that appeared in forbidden poneglyphs, and that name was never spoken aloud, because in the ancient texts, whoever said it lost their voice for the rest of their life. Luffy stood up, grabbed his hat, and said he was going alone, because if it was a trap, the only one who should fall was him. Bonnie grabbed his arm, begged him not to go, told him her father Kuma had always told her that a certain enemy was never faced alone. But Luffy gently pulled away, ruffled Bonnie's hair, and promised her he'd be back before dinner, because he was hungry and Sanji was cooking. Luffy activated Gear 5 without warning and rose toward the red sky of Elbaf like a white comet, leaving his Nakama watching from below. He climbed above the clouds, broke through 3 layers of storm, and reached a floating stone platform that no human had seen in 1,000 years. In the center of the platform stood a throne of black stone, and seated on it was a shadow wrapped in a robe darker than the void. Imu did not move when Luffy landed, did not raise his head, did not breathe heavily, simply let the silence grow as dense as a deep sea. Luffy walked up until he stood in front of the throne, crossed his arms, and asked him directly if he was the one who had ordered the killing of his brother Ace at Marineford. The shadow beneath the robe laughed softly, a laugh that sounded like glass breaking slowly, and for the first time, Luffy felt a chill in his stomach. Imu answered yes, that the order to execute Ace had come from his mouth, not from Sengoku, not from Akainu, not from Saturn, and he explained that it had been a test, that he wanted to see how the next Nika would react to the loss of a brother of blood and of oath. Luffy lowered his head for a second, clenched his fists until the veins stood out, and when he looked back at Imu, his eyes were glowing with pure haki. He told him in a calm voice, without shouting, without trembling, that information had just signed the death sentence of the king behind all the king. Imu smiled beneath the robe, leaned forward, and whispered that it was not the first time a Nika had spoken to him in that exact way. Luffy launched the first attack without warning, a Gomu Gomu no King Cobra loaded with all the conqueror's haki he had built up over years of terrible battles. The fist crossed the air like a white meteor, and the entire platform shook, and the giants in Elbaf looked up feeling the roar of the Nika. But Imu did not move. He only raised one finger, and the strongest attack Luffy had ever thrown in his life dissolved like smoke in the wind. Luffy blinked. He didn't understand what had happened. He attacked again, this time with a gigantic bazooka so huge it blotted out the sun that wasn't even there anymore. Imu sighed. He moved his hand, and the gigantic bazooka evaporated before it touched him, leaving not even wind behind, not even an echo in the sky. And then Imu rose from the throne, and for the first time in 800 years, 2 absolute-level conquerors' haki clashed in the sky of the New World. The sky of Elbaf split into 2 halves visible from the ground, one half still in daylight, the other plunged into an eternal black night. The giants who had seen 1,000 wars fell to their knees crying because they understood without words that they were witnessing something that would not be seen again for another 1,000 years. Luffy's haki was white streaked with red wild free, full of cries of the open sea, and promises made on barrels under the moons of 100 islands. Imu's haki was black streaked with gold, cold, ancient, full of long silences and secrets kept for 8 centuries on a throne without witnesses. When the 2 hakis touched, the very air broke, and for an instant every Denden Mushi in the world stopped working at the same time. When the clash ended, Luffy was on his knees, not wounded, not tired, just kneeling, as if his body had understood something his head was still denying. Imu walked toward him slowly, with the steps of someone who had already walked that same path many times before, toward many other young men like him. He touched his forehead with one finger, just one finger, and Luffy spit blood, not from the force of the blow, but from something deep inside that broke. Imu spoke to him gently, almost almost with affection, like a father speaking to a son who is about to hear a truth that will hurt forever. He told him he wasn't the first, that the Hito no Mi model Nika had already been eaten 4 times before him, in 4 different centuries. 3 of those 4 had been turned into monsters, just like he was going to be turned into one in the next few minutes on that same platform. Only one had managed to resist, and that one was called Joy Boy, and Joy Boy had resisted by choosing to die rather than be corrupted by the king who was listening. Luffy lifted his head, and for the first time in his life, he found no words, no smile, no answer, only a silence that weighed heavy. Imu crouched until his face, hidden by the robe, was level with Luffy's, and whispered the sentence that would set everything in motion. He told him not to worry, because he too would have his chance to choose to die, right after killing his Nakama with his own hands. Luffy opened his mouth to scream, but before the sound came out, Imu's hand was already on his chest, and the corruption had begun. Luffy's chest began to glow with red light that wasn't coming out of him, but pouring in from Imu's hand, like an infection that would never heal. Luffy shook, tried to use Gear 5 to defend himself, but his own devil fruit betrayed him, because the fruit itself was being commanded by something older. Red threads began to sprout from his skin, first from his chest, then from his arms, then from his neck, as if his blood had turned into visible fire. His eyes changed one by one. First the left turned bright red, then the right tried to resist, but ended up giving in to the demonic corruption. His hair turned darker and wilder, his smile stretched until it became something inhuman, and from his mouth came a new laugh, different, terrible. It was the same old shishishi laugh, but deeper, longer, more distorted, as if someone had recorded Luffy laughing and played it backwards. Inside that head, however, the real Luffy was still awake. He saw everything. He felt everything, but he couldn't move a single finger of his own body. It was like being chained at the bottom of an ocean, watching himself from far away, hearing his own voice say things he would never have said. Imu stepped back twice, looked at his finished work, and for the first time in 800 years, a single black tear ran down his hidden cheek. He whispered that Joy Boy had cost him more effort, but that this Nika was younger, purer, and that was why he was going to break faster. The demon wearing Luffy's face slowly turned its head toward Imu, smiled with those new teeth, and asked a question that froze the air. He asked where dinner was, because he was hungry, and the Nakama down below in Elbaf looked like a good menu to start the night. Demon Luffy let himself drop from the red sky without jumping, without flying, without slowing down, simply fell like a stone that knew exactly where it wanted to land. The impact against the ground of Elbaf opened a crater 100 yards across, and the dust rose, blotting out the sun that wasn't there either. When the dust settled, the giants saw someone standing in the center of the crater, someone with a straw hat and red eyes glowing in the darkness. Loki, who was closest, was the first to shout Luffy's name with joy, because he thought his new friend had come back victorious from his fight. But Demon Luffy lifted his head, looked at Loki, and let out that corrupted shishishi laugh that made the giant prince take 3 trembling steps back. Behind Loki came the Straw Hats running, all together, all smiling openly, all believing their captain had pulled off the impossible once again. Bonnie was running out front, shouting Luffy's name, waving her arms, ready to hug him and tell him she had been worried about him all afternoon. But Zoro, who was behind her, grabbed Bonnie by the shoulder and stopped her dead, because his haki had just detected something that shouldn't be there. Sanji stopped beside Zoro, looked at the crater, looked at the figure standing in the center, and whispered that that wasn't Luffy, that something was wrong. Robin's eyes went wide, because she had read about this in ancient poneglyphs, and now she was seeing live what those forbidden texts had described. And then Demon Luffy smiled at them, raised a rubber hand, stretched all the way over to where they stood, and waved at them affectionately before starting the massacre. Before moving, before attacking, before taking a single step, Demon Luffy unleashed something that no one had ever seen in the known history of the entire world. It wasn't Conqueror's haki. It wasn't ordinary King's haki. It was a new, dark version where the will wasn't imposed but completely rewritten. The giants of Elbaf, the proudest warriors of the sea, all fell to their knees at the same time, and some began vomiting blood with no explanation. Loki, the cursed prince, tried to resist by raising his broken arms, but ended up kneeling too, with tears coming from his eyes without him calling them. The Straw Hats, who had haki training, managed to stay on their feet, but each of them felt as if an invisible hand were squeezing their heart. Bonnie fell to her knees, Chopper started crying and couldn't stop, and Brook, a skeleton, felt the weight of death for the first time in years. Jinbei stepped forward, planted himself in front of the others, and said out loud that he was going to be the first to talk to the captain. He walked alone toward the crater, not trembling on the outside, even though on the inside his bones were screaming for him to come back, to run, that this would not end well. Demon Luffy saw him coming, tilted his head like a curious animal, and smiled at him with a new fondness, the kind of fondness cats have right before they kill. Jinbei stood in front of him, looked into the red eyes, and told him in a firm voice that he had already chosen his captain twice. He told him the first time had been out of respect, the second out of friendship, but that this third time he wasn't going to do it because it wasn't necessary. Because no matter what happened, his captain was Luffy, and Luffy was still in there, no matter how dark the red was in his eyes that night. Demon Luffy heard those words, and for a tenth of a second, the left eye flickered back to its original black, and the red threads went still. Inside his head, the real Luffy screamed Jinbei's name, tried to move, tried to take back control of his body, but Imu clenched his fist from far away, and then the eyes turned red again, the smile stretched back out, and Demon Luffy's hand rose with the palm open toward his helmsman. Inside Luffy's mind, Imu appeared for the first time, seated on a mental throne identical to his own, smiling with a mouth that could now be seen. He spoke softly to him, told him it was time to start dinner, and introduced the first course, which would be the biggest fish on the crew. Luffy, in his mind, threw himself at Imu, tried to hit him, but the king behind the kings just moved his hand, and Luffy slammed into an invisible wall. Imu then whispered the first revelation to him, the one that would open every wound. The order to kill Ace at Marineford had been an experiment. He told him he had wanted to study the next Nika to see how he would react to loss, and that Ace's death had been the price of that information. But he told him more, told him that the Celestial Dragon's ship accident that wiped Sabo's memory had also not been an accident, but a careful order from him. He explained that a Nika could not grow up surrounded by strong brothers, that he had to grow up alone, losing one after another until the pain defined him. Luffy screamed. He screamed so loud that inside the mental landscape a storm rose up, but outside, in the real world, his hand kept coming down toward Jinbei. Jinbei saw the blow coming. He didn't move. He didn't dodge. He took the attack from the demon with his captain inside and flew 100 yards into a rock. He fell to the ground without moving, with one arm bent at an impossible angle and a thread of blood at his mouth, but breathing, alive, still alive, by sheer miracle. Loki saw Jinbei fall, and something inside him broke, because the cursed prince had spent his whole life waiting for a friend like Luffy had been. He dragged himself out of the paralyzing haki with his broken arms, biting his lips to keep from screaming in pain, leaving a red trail on the green grass. He reached the edge of the crater, lifted his head toward Demon Luffy, and shouted at him that he had promised they were going to be free together in this new world. He shouted at him not to give up, that they should fight together against the king behind the kings, that between the two of them they could burn down the old world and build another one. Demon Luffy turned toward Loki, looked down at him with genuine curiosity, and walked calmly over to where the giant prince stood with his broken arms. And for a second, a single second, the demon's left eye flickered back to its original black, and Luffy recognized the friend who had sworn shared freedom with him. Loki saw that flicker, smiled with blood on his teeth, and told him quietly that it was okay, that he understood, that between cursed princes these things happened. But the eye turned red again. Imu clenched his fist from far away, and the affection of the moment before turned into a cold, distant curiosity. He placed a finger on his forehead, just like Imu had done to him up in the sky, and pushed back softly, without malice, without visible effort. Loki, the prince who had beaten warriors 15 feet tall, was launched 2 miles backwards by a single finger and sank into the Elbaf ground. The giants, watching from afar, still on their knees, all screamed in horror at the same time, because they had just seen their pride fall in 3 seconds. Inside, in his mind, Luffy was screaming for them to stop, that Loki was his friend, that he had just promised him freedom only a few days ago in this very place. But mental Imu came up on his inner throne, ran his hand through his hair like an evil father, and told him to get used to the pain, because dinner was just beginning, and he still had to meet his main guests, the ones who were trembling on the other side of the crater, not knowing what to do. On the other side of the crater, the Straw Hats were paralyzed, not by haki this time, but by the emotional impossibility of raising a hand against their captain. Zoro was the first to shake off the shock, grabbed his 3 swords, and said in a calm voice that he was going to go first, that this burden was his. Sanji stepped up next to Zoro without arguing, lit a new cigarette, and said quietly that it was the first time they were truly fighting on the same side. Nami grabbed her climatac backed, her hand trembled, and she whispered that she couldn't fight Luffy, that she had owed him her life ever since Arlong Park. Robin put a hand on Nami's shoulder, told her no one was going to fight to kill him, that they were going to fight to bring him back home. Chopper was crying non-stop, repeating that he was a doctor, that he had to cure him, that he had to find the disease that had turned his captain into that. Usopp was trembling with Kabuto in his hands, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about running away. He was thinking about firing the most important arrow. Frankie fired up his arms, his eyes filled with tears that evaporated before they fell, and he said that a straw hat never abandons the captain. Brook took out his violin instead of his sword, rested it on his shoulder, and began to play Bink Sak, soft, slow, like a prayer for those who are leaving. And Bonnie, the youngest of them all, stepped forward with her fists clenched and said that she had a power, and that power would save Luffy. But before she could explain the plan, Demon Luffy was already walking toward them with that twisted Nika smile, ready to start the second course. Zoro was the first to clash with Demon Luffy, launching Santoryu Tatsumaki, and the cutting wind sliced through the air toward the body of his transformed captain. But Demon Luffy raised his hand, and his rubber arms stretched out in the air, forming 3 lines that held 3 invisible swords of haki. He returned the attack exactly the same, with the same technique, with the same rotation, but faster, stronger, as if he had been training for years in silence. Zoro could barely block and flew backwards, spitting blood, while Demon Luffy smiled and told him he had really liked that technique. Sanji came in from the side with Diablo Jambe burning at maximum, launching a spinning kick that would normally split a stone wall in one strike. Demon Luffy stopped the kick with a single hand, and fire shot out from his other leg, exactly the same fire, but staining the air black. The demon spun around, launched the copied kick with double the rotation, and shouted the name of the technique in the exact voice of the cook. Sanji heard his own shout coming from his captain's mouth, and for a second he wondered if the leg coming at him was his own or the demon's. The blow sent him flying 200 feet. He landed next to Zoro, coughing blood, and the first thing he whispered was that the demon knew his whole voice. The Straw Hats stood frozen for 3 seconds. No one breathed, no one spoke. Only the wind of Elbaf moved the green grass as if time had frozen. Nami trembled, raised her Klimatact, and generated a lightning bolt with all the hatred and love she had gathered sailing with the captain for 10 years. The bolt crossed the blue air toward the demon, and Demon Luffy raised his arm confidently, ready to copy it, ready to throw it back with double the force. But when he tried to copy it, his hand trembled. The bolt that came out of his palm was weak, scattered, incomplete, as if the technique had been left without a soul. It crashed into Nami's bolt in the middle, and instead of throwing it back, it canceled out in a white flash that made both sides blink. Robin noticed it first. Her eyes went wide, and she whispered that the demon could copy the techniques, but couldn't copy the love with which Nami threw them. Inside Luffy's mind, on the invisible throne, the real Luffy smiled for the first time that night, because he understood where the crack in the plan was. Mental Imu saw him smile, snapped his head around, and for a fraction of a second, something like worry crossed his face, hidden in the robe. It was disturbing. It was beautiful in a sick way, but it was no longer perfect, and a crack, no matter how thin, is always where the light eventually gets in. In the middle of the chaos, inside Luffy's mind, Imu came back over to the throne, where his prisoner was still bound by very strong, invisible red threads. He spoke to him in a casual tone, like someone commenting on the weather, told him he had important news about someone Luffy had spent years believing was lost. He told him his mother was alive, that he knew her well, and that she was on her way to Elbaf that very night to see the result of her son. Mental Luffy heard that, and for the first time he didn't know if it was a lie, because he had never known anything about his mother, had never heard her name. Imu went on, told him she wasn't going to cry, that she was proud of what was being done to him, because she also worked for the Hidden King. He told him his mother had spent 20 years preparing this moment, that every time he had run into trouble, she had given information to Mary Joai. Luffy screamed that it was a lie, that his mother couldn't be like that he wasn't going to believe a word he was saying right then. But Imu smiled and told him that soon he would see her with his own eyes, and that when he did, he would wish he had never asked about her. While that was happening in his mind, in the real world, Demon Luffy grabbed Robin by the arm and lifted her off the ground like a rag doll. Robin didn't fight. She held the gaze of the demon wearing the captain's face and told him quietly that she had already survived Ohara once. She told him she was going to survive this too, that she had a dream to fulfill, that he himself had promised to see it through with her on this journey. Demon Luffy squeezed her hard, and for a tenth of a second, the right eye flickered back to its original black before Imu clenched his fist again. Demon Luffy let go of Robin without hurting her anymore and took 2 steps back, looking at his crew with a new expression, an almost amused expression, and then he threw his head back, opened his mouth wide, and let out that corrupted shishi laugh, the laugh that was Luffy's but was no longer his. It was deeper, longer, more profound, as if the voice had dropped 3 octaves and mixed with the sound of chains dragging across stone. Nami covered her ears with both hands, fell to her knees, and started crying non-stop, because that was the laugh that had saved her at Arlong Park. It was the same laugh, but rotted from the inside, as if someone had taken the happiest sound of her childhood and buried it for years. Chopper screamed for him to stop, begged the demon to stop laughing like that, because every corrupted shishishi was breaking his heart into tiny pieces. Brook lowered his violin, stopped playing Bink Sake, because his music could not compete with that laugh, and for the first time in years, he felt real fear. Usopp aimed with Kabuto, tried to fire a star, but his hands were trembling so much that the arrow fell to the ground before it could be shot forward. Frankie covered his ears with his huge arms and whispered that that laugh wasn't the captain's, that his captain never laughed like that it was different. Bonnie clenched her fists until they bled and started walking forward, because she had decided right then what she was going to do with her power that night. But Zoro stopped her with an outstretched arm and told her in a low voice that it wasn't the moment yet, that first he had to try something important. He told her he was the first mate, and that this burden fell to him before anyone else, and walked toward the demon with his 3 swords ready. Zoro walked alone toward the center of the crater, leaving the others behind, with his 3 swords ready, and the look of someone who had already decided. Demon Luffy saw him coming, smiled with those new teeth, and gave him a mock bow, as if to say it was time for the main dance of the night. Zoro got into Santoryu's stance, gripped Wado Ichimonji between his teeth, held Sandai Kitetsu and Enma in his 2 hands, and took a deep breath once. He told his captain, not knowing whether he was listening in there, that he was going to have to wound him, that he was going to have to drive a sword into him today, but that wound wasn't going to be to kill, but to bring him back, because sometimes the only way to save someone was to remind them they could still feel. And he charged. He crossed the distance in a blink, dodged 2 rubber arms that stretched out to intercept him, and reached the demon's body in a flash. Wado Ichimonji, Queena's sword, Zoro's oldest promise, ran through Demon Luffy's left shoulder, without killing him, just wounding him perfectly. The demon went still. For a 1/10 of a second, both red eyes flickered back to their original black. The red threads went quiet, and Luffy smiled. Not the demon. Luffy, the real one. He smiled with his usual smile, looked Zoro in the eyes, and whispered a single word that Zoro heard clearly. He whispered, "Thank you, just thank you," as if that 1 second of real pain had given him a breath, a rest, an instant of being himself again. And then the eyes turned red again, the threads sprouted out again, and Demon Luffy's hand grabbed Zoro by the neck with absolute inhuman force. Zoro understood in that instant that Wado Ichimonji wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work because he couldn't fight with all his heart holding the sword of his dream. He couldn't attack with Queena's sword against the kid who had given him the place to fulfill it. It was a contradiction his soul could not bear. He raised Wado above his head, looked at the red sky of Elbaf, and asked Quina for forgiveness, with his eyes closed before breaking it. He broke it against a rock, splitting it in 2, and the 2 halves fell to the green grass stained with dust and blood, shining under the last light of day. He told Demon Luffy, he told the Luffy inside, that he could fight without his dream, that his captain came first, that his captain had always come first. And he attacked again with the other 2 swords, this time with everything, holding nothing back, doubting nothing, with the speed of the true Roronoa Zoro. He cut the air around the demon, struck him 5 times in the torso, slammed him into a stone wall with a new technique born of desperation. Demon Luffy stood up from the crater without a single visible wound, dusting off his clothes, and clapped at him 3 times with that rotten Nika smile. He told him that had been a good fight, that Zoro had always been the strongest of the Straw Hats, and that was why he had saved him for the end, but that now it was time to show him who the truly strongest on the ship was, and he began to move in a way Zoro had never seen. Sanji came in leaping from one side, shouting that he wasn't going to let Zoro fight this alone, because this wasn't a fight, it was a family intervention, and the 2 eternal rivals, the cook and the swordsman, stood back to back, ready to face the demon that wore their captain's face together. Sanji lit another cigarette in the middle of the battle, glanced at Zoro out of the corner of his eye, and told him it was probably the last time they would fight together. Zoro nodded without looking at him and answered that then it had better be worth it, because he didn't want to have to listen to him complaining later on the other side. Demon Luffy saw them together, and for the first time all night he stopped smiling, because something in that image touched something deep in his mind. He charged at them with both fists loaded with demonic haki, and the eternal rivals leapt in opposite directions to flank the demon from 2 angles. Sanji attacked with Diable Jambe Flambe, launching launching a kick that left a trail of fire in the air, striking the demon on the left side of the body. Zoro attacked with a Sura, generating 9 phantom swords around his body, and cut the demon in 6 places at the same time from the other side. Demon Luffy fell to his knees. For the first time all night, he had fallen to his knees, and the 2 Nakama allowed themselves to believe in victory for an instant. But then the demon's 2 hands stretched out at the same time, one toward Zoro, the other toward Sanji, and the 2 necks were caught in rubber claws. He lifted them off the ground, brought them close to his face, and smiled at them both with that twisted Nika smile, while slowly squeezing their throats with no hurry. Inside, in his mind, Luffy was screaming, pounding on the invisible wall, trying to break the red threads that bound him to the mental throne where he was a prisoner. Mental Imu came up, ran his hand through his hair again, and told him it was time for the 3rd lesson, the most painful one of the dinner. Imu sat down facing him in the mental landscape, folded his hands in his lap, and told him it was time to talk about his entire crew. He told him that every Nakama Luffy had found along the way had not been found by chance, but had been placed there on purpose. He told him that he, Imu, had spent decades studying the perfect candidates, had tracked them down, had placed them in strategic locations across the sea. Nami escaping Arlong on the exact island where Luffy's ship was going to pass. Usopp in Syrup Village right when the Going Merry needed repairs. Chopper in Drum right when Nami was about to get sick. Robin fleeing from justice right when Luffy was ready to take in a forbidden archaeologist. Each of them had been a piece carefully placed on the board, and Luffy had walked among the pieces, believing he was choosing them when he was being given them. He told him he had built his family so he could destroy it with his own hands that night, because for a Nika to fall, he had to lose what he loved. Mental Luffy screamed that it was a lie, that they had chosen him, that they had wanted to follow him, that that decision had been free and true. Imu laughed softly and told him that freedom was the most manipulable thing of all, because free people believed their choices were their own. And he hit him with the second blow, told him that Zoro had blood from the Shimotsuki clan, a clan that carried the ancestral lineage of killing kings for generations. He told him that Zoro had been raised to kill the Pirate King, that he had known it since he was a child, and that one day he would have to fulfill his destiny. Mental Luffy screamed Zoro's name, tried to shake off the chains, but the red threads tightened harder and left him without even mental breath. Outside, in the crater, Chopper had pressed his ear against the demon captain's chest, taking advantage of the fact that Imu had him distracted somewhere far away inside. What he heard froze his hooves, 2 hearts beating out of sync, one fast and golden, another slow and black, fighting over the same body with no clear winner. He shouted to the others that Luffy was alive inside, that the golden heart was still beating, that they could pull him out if they found a way to reach him from outside. Loki, still dragging himself with broken arms, lifted his head from far away and whispered a word that the wind of Elbaf carried all the way to the golden heart. He whispered Nakama, the same word from the dream, the one Joy Boy had tried to tell Luffy 3 nights earlier under a different moon of Elbaf. Inside Luffy's mind, for a second, the mental wind went still, and a single word drifted across the gray landscape like a feather floating on motionless air. Mental Luffy heard it. He didn't know where it was coming from. He couldn't grab it, but something in his chest recognized the sound and began to push against the red threads. Imu snapped his head around, searched for the origin of the word, couldn't find it, and for the first time that night, something like haste crossed his robe. He picked up the pace, walked to a wall of the landscape, raised his hand. Because he could no longer waste time on a single wound, he needed to open another, deeper one. Imu raised his hand and with one motion opened a window in the wall of the landscape, a window that showed scenes from a future that hadn't happened yet. Luffy saw Robin standing in front of him with empty eyes, holding in her hands the last poneglyph, the one that contained the truth about the One Piece. Robin was looking at him with sadness, telling him she was very sorry, that there were truths he could not know, that there were paths that had to part, and she would disappear into the shadows of the poneglyph, leaving Luffy standing alone, without the archaeologist who had been his Nakama through years of ocean voyages. Imu closed the window, turned toward chained mental Luffy, and told him that his archaeologist was going to choose truth over him, always. He reminded him that in Ohara she had chosen to live, in Eni's lobby she had chosen the dream, and one day she was going to choose truth over friendship. Luffy screamed that it wasn't true, that Robin would never abandon him, that he knew her better than any prediction from a king hidden on a throne. But the doubt stayed. The doubt lingered in there like a black seed in fertile soil, waiting to grow at the least opportune moment of the night. Imu leaned in toward him, stroked his cheek with 2 cold fingers, and told him that soon he would stop fighting because no strength would be left in him. He told him that when dinner was over, when all his Nakama were lying on the ground of Elbaf, he would finally understand what it meant to be free, because real freedom was having having nothing to lose, and he, Luffy, was going to be free that night, free of the family that was getting in his way. While all of that was happening in his mind, in the real world, Demon Luffy was still squeezing the necks of Zoro and Sanji, slowly, with a smile of twisted affection. Zoro, with no air, unable to speak, held the gaze of the demon wearing the captain's face and whispered something that Sanji also heard. He whispered to him that it was okay, that he could squeeze harder if he needed to, that neck had decided to follow him since Shimotsuki and belonged to him completely. Sanji heard that, and despite the lack of air, smiled with that cook's smile that only appeared when things were truly lost for everyone, and he whispered too, told him that his neck was his as well, that his left leg and his right leg and his heart too, everything had always belonged to him. He told him he could cook their last dinner with pride, because dying choked by his own captain was the best ending a cook could ask for. That voluntary surrender, that total giving over, made the demon tremble. For 2 whole seconds, the red threads pulsed strong and weak, hesitating. Inside the mind, Luffy heard the voices of Zoro and Sanji, and something broke, not in a bad way, but like something that was finally time. He began to pull on the mental chains with a new strength, a strength that came not from rage, but from love, a strength Imu had not accounted for. Imu noticed it. For the first time that night, his smile vanished beneath the robe, and he turned his head toward the Straw Hats, watching from afar. He chose the next victim. He chose the one that would hurt the most. He chose the one that would break Luffy in a way words could not repair. Demon Luffy let go of Zoro and Sanji. Both fell to the ground, coughing for air, alive by inches, saved by 2 seconds of hesitation in their transformed captain. And he walked calmly to where Nami was, she who had not moved from the spot where she had fallen to her knees, listening to the corrupted Shishishi laugh from before. Nami saw him coming, and for an instant she thought about running, thought about hiding, thought about doing everything her survivor's instinct had taught her. But then she remembered. She remembered the day Luffy had arrived at Kokoyashi. She remembered the straw hat he had placed on her head while she trembled. She remembered the scream that had come out of her throat begging him for help, and the wordless answer that had come in the form of a stretched rubber fist. And then she stood up from the ground, brushed off the dust, and walked forward to meet her transformed captain without running, without hiding, without trembling. Demon Luffy stopped when she came up in front of him, tilted his head, and looked at her with genuine curiosity, because he had not expected that walk toward him. He smiled at her with that rotten Nika smile, raised a hand to her neck, and closed it around the navigator's throat with growing force. Nami did not fight. She held the gaze of the demon wearing the captain's face and began to speak to him quietly, in a calm voice, almost like a sick mother. She told him the weather was going to change. She told him it always changed. She told him that even though the sky was red now, tomorrow it would be blue again. That sentence, that callback to the day he had saved her at Arlong Park, struck something in the demon that no physical attack had managed to strike until now. Demon Luffy held Nami in the air, no longer squeezing, but not letting go either, simply holding her, as if his body didn't know what to do in that moment. And then, with his free hand, he did something no Straw Hat had ever expected to see in their life, something that felt like a cruel joke from the entire universe. He stretched his arm back, charged it with red demonic haki, and prepared to launch the first technique Luffy had ever learned in his young life. Gomu Gomu no Pistol, the first attack, the one he had used to defend Nami from Arlong on the most important day of the navigator's life. The fist that had saved her was now aimed at her face, loaded with demonic power, ready to finish what the king behind the kings had started. Nami saw it coming. She saw the arm charge up. She saw the hand form the fist. She saw the red haki glow on the knuckle, and she did not close her eyes. She held the gaze of the demon wearing the captain's face and whispered to him in a broken voice something that would be carved into memory. She told him that Fist had saved her life once. She told him now he could take it back if he needed to, that it was still his fist all the same. She told him that no matter what happened, she was going to die a straw hat, struck by her captain's hand, and that was an honor greater than gold. The fist crossed the air. It flew toward her face. It came within a hair of touching her, and it stopped. It stopped on its own, without her moving at all. Demon Luffy's arm began to tremble. The red threads pulsed weak and strong, and for the first time all night, the demon closed his eyes. Inside the mind, in the gray landscape where Luffy was bound to the mental throne, something changed in the air, something even Imu had not fully planned for. Voices began to be heard, distant voices, voices of men and women Luffy had never known, voices that came from very far away and from deep within. Imu stood up from the throne, snapped around toward the source of the sound, and for the first time his voice showed something like real surprise. He told Luffy not to listen, to ignore the voices, but Luffy was already hearing them, already recognizing them, even though he had never heard heard them before. They were the voices of the 4 previous Nika, the 3 who had fallen and the 1 who had resisted, Joy Boy himself, speaking to him through the fruit itself. 3 of the voices were telling him to surrender, that everyone surrendered eventually, that it was useless to fight against the king behind the kings in any era. But the 4th voice, Joy Boy's voice, told him something different, told him he was different, that he had something the previous ones had never had. And then Joy Boy spoke the word, the same word from the dream, the one Luffy had been unable to say out loud on the Sunny 2 nights earlier. He told him Nakama, a single word. The warning from the dream had not been a danger, but an instruction, a key Luffy had carried for 3 days. Mental Luffy understood in that instant. The word was not for defense. The word was to remind him what made him different from the 4 Nika before him. He told him the previous Nika had fought alone, that the difference between falling and holding on was who was waiting outside shouting your name with love. And he told him to look outside, to see what Nami was doing, to see the total surrender, to see the love no king could ever manipulate. Imu tried to silence the voice, tried to interrupt, but for the first time there was someone stronger than him in that mind, and that voice was Joy Boy's. Joy Boy whispered one more line to him, told him that real freedom is not inherited and not granted, but built with those who hold you up. Robin was the first to notice, saw that the demon had trembled, saw that the right eye had flickered, and understood in a second where the crack was. She shouted to the others that their memories were hurting him, that shared memories were the one thing the demon could not control or copy in any way. And Nami, still hanging by the neck in the air, was the first to open her mouth and shout to the sky the most important memory of her life. She shouted the day he rescued her at Arlong Park, the day he put the hat on her head, the day she cried asking for help. Demon Luffy's arm went slack. He let her go. Nami fell to the ground on her knees, coughing for air, but she was already shouting the next memory non-stop. And then Usopp stood up from the ground, raised Kabuto to the sky, and shouted the promise of Water 7, the promise to meet again, already kept. Chopper took 2 steps forward in his small form, crying non-stop, and shouted to the demon the day Luffy told him he had to become a monster. He shouted that day he had learned what it meant to be free, that day he had found a family, that day his life had truly begun. Sanji, still lying on the ground coughing, raised his head and shouted the moment of whole cake when Luffy hit him to bring him back. He shouted that those blows had been the most important of his life, that day he understood what it meant to have a captain worth more than a father. Brook lowered his violin, took a step forward, and with his broken singing voice shouted the day Luffy had called him Nakama without even knowing who he was. He shouted that day he had felt alive again after 50 years of loneliness in the darkness of an ocean with no stars and no known hopes. Frankie stood up with his arms blazing and shouted the day Luffy asked him to build the ship of dreams, the day the Sunny was born. He shouted that day his life had found the meaning he had been searching for years, that day he had stopped running and started building free. Robin walked up until she stood beside Nami, lifted her face toward the demon, and shouted the day Luffy declared war on the world government for her. She shouted that day he gave her permission to want to live for the first time in her life, that day she stopped being a fugitive and became a straw hat. Zoro pulled himself up however he could, grabbed the 2 swords he had left after breaking Wado, and shouted the day of the East Blue, the first oath. He shouted that day he had decided to follow him until death, that decision was still standing, that no demon in the world was ever going to change it. And behind them all, Jinbei, wounded but alive, raised a weak hand and shouted the day Luffy called him helmsman without him daring to ask for it. He shouted that day he felt for the first time that he belonged to something greater than himself, something worth carrying to the end of the sea. Each shouted memory struck the demon like an invisible fist. The red threads pulsed weaker. The right eye lingered longer in its black color. Inside the mind, Luffy stood up from the throne. The mental red threads loosened, and he began to walk toward Imu with a strength that kept growing. Imu took a step back. For the first time in 800 years, the king behind the kings stepped back in his own mental landscape built to always win. But before giving in, he still had one more blow up his sleeve, the final blow, the one that would throw Luffy into the deepest pit of the soul. Imu stopped Luffy in the middle of the mental landscape, raised both hands, and told him he had 2 more things to tell him before his resistance. He first told him the oldest secret, the one no human being being had ever heard in the known history of the Blue Sea or the entire New World. He told him that the dream of being the king of the pirates as a free man did not exist, that dream was an idea he had invented centuries ago. He told him he had planted that idea like a carrot in front of a horse so that men would dream of freedom while he ruled them in silence. He told him Roger had died chasing a dream that he, Imu, had invented, and that Luffy was going to die the same way, chasing the same old lie. And before Luffy could answer, he hit him with the second blow, the last one, the one that was going to break even what was left of his final will. He told him that when he was done with him that night, he was going to erase his name from history, just as he had erased Joy Boy exactly 800 years ago. He told him his Nakama would wake up the next day not remembering him, that Nami would not know why she had a map of the world on her desk. He told him Zoro would not know why he carried 3 swords, that Sanji would not know why he dreamed of an all-blue sea no one had ever seen. He told him he was going to disappear, that it would be as if he had never been born, that Monkey D. Luffy would be erased like a misspelled word. Mental Luffy heard that, and for a second he was silent, looking at the king behind the kings with an expression no one had seen on him before. And then he smiled. He smiled with his usual smile, the uncorrupted Shishishi smile, and said something to Imu that changed the mental geography forever. Mental Luffy told Imu that in that case he was going to make a freedom of his own, a new freedom, one that was not his, one that he had not invented. He told him he was going to build it with his Nakama, with their mistakes, with their laughter, with barrels of sake shared on every island they left behind. He told him that that new freedom could never be controlled by a king hidden on a throne, because it would be so different that he would not even recognize it. And he told him more, told him that even if he erased his name from 1,000 books, his Nakama would always know who he had been, because he lived inside them. He told him he could erase Monkey D. Luffy from the poneglyphs, from the records, from the maps, from the songs sung in 100 sailor taverns, but that he could never erase the smile he put on Nami's face the day of Arlong, or the promise he shouted to Vivi on the beach of Alabasta. He could never erase the sake he shared with Brooke, or the ship Frankie built, or the map Robin was carrying for him in silence. He told him that he, Luffy, was not a name, not a title, not an entry in a book written by kings afraid of free pirates. He told him he was every Nakama embraced, every enemy defeated, every barrel emptied, every Shishishi laugh he had left floating in the sea air. And that, he told him looking him dead in the eye, that could never be erased, not with all the power of a king hidden behind an eternal black robe. Imu took another step back, and then Luffy charged at him, broke through the invisible wall, and began to snap the red threads one by one, all on his own. While that was happening in the mind, in the real world, something else was happening, something that would be the final piece needed to free the captain. Bonnie had been walking slowly all this time toward the center of the crater, without anyone noticing her, with her fists clenched and her eyes full of determination. She reached where Demon Luffy was, frozen in the middle of the field, still with his hand closed in the air where a second before there had been a neck. She looked up at him because she was small and he was tall, and told him that her dad Kuma had told her stories of the Sun God Nika when she was a little girl. She told him her dad had been a slave, had been beaten, had been erased, but that in his memories there had always been a smile, the smile of the free god. She told him that smile was his, was Luffy's, was the Nika's, and that she had grown up believing in that smile the way other kids believe in stars. And she told him that now it was her turn to return the favor, to give the god back the freedom the god had given to her dad Kuma years before. She put both hands on Demon Luffy's chest, right where Imu had placed his hand to corrupt him in the center of the red threads, and she activated her devil fruit at a level she had never used before, a level that would consume her, a level her father had always forbidden her. She began to rewind him, to rewind Luffy, to rewind him too, before the corruption, before the throne, before the message, before the moment everything changed. But for every second she rewound Luffy, she aged 5 years in her own body, losing the time she had left so that he could get his own back. The Straw Hats saw what was happening, and all at the same time shouted Bonnie's name, shouted for her to stop, that she had to stop, that it was too much. Bonnie did not stop. She smiled at Demon Luffy while she aged, while her hair changed color, while her young skin began to be marked with fine lines. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20. Her cheeks sank in, her back began to curve, her hands filled with prominent trembling veins. But the red threads on Luffy's body were also pulling back, also disappearing, also being sent back to the sky from which they had come down. Luffy's right eye stayed black, the left one stayed red, fighting, resisting being given back, holding on to the last strip of the corruption. Bonnie pushed harder, without shouting, without crying, just smiling, and kept rewinding Luffy beyond where her teenage body could bear the cost. 30 years, 40 40. Her hair turned white as snow. Her eyes clouded over. Her teeth began to fall out one by one onto the green grass. Inside Luffy's mind, he felt Bonnie, felt the sacrifice, felt how every year of her life turned into a snapped red thread. The threads fell to the floor of the mental landscape like ribbons of dried blood, one for every decade paid, weaving on the ground a carpet impossible to forget. Mental Imu watched them fall, and for the first time understood that those threads were not corruption. They were the physical record of how much love he had underestimated that night. He shouted the name of the youngest pirate, shouted for her to stop, shouted that he could go on alone from there, but Bonnie in the real world was no longer listening. She was smiling, just smiling, as if at last, after a whole life spent searching for her dad Kuma, she had understood what it was he had taught her. That real love was aging for someone else. That real freedom was being able to choose to spend your own time giving time to someone who was worth it. Bonnie finished rewinding the last red thread, the last remnant of the corruption, and Luffy's eyes both went back to black, as they had been at the start. And then Bonnie's body began to come apart. First the hands, then the arms, then the face, slowly, like sand carried away by a gentle wind. She smiled at Luffy one last time, with the little girl smile she had when she stepped on the oath barrel 2 nights earlier at the camp. And she told him, with the voice of the little girl she had been, with the voice that used to tell Kuma she missed him every single night without him. She told him her dad had been right about him, told him the Straw Hat was everything the stories had promised, that he was worth growing old for. She told him to take care of himself, to take care of his Nakama, to take care of the sea, to one day tell someone the story of the pirate who smiled. And she came apart in the air. Her body turned to dust. The dust mixed with the wind. The wind carried the dust out toward the open sea, far away. Luffy stood alone in the middle of the crater, with empty hands, where a second before, Bonnie's hands had been pressed against his chest with love. He fell to his knees. He did not shout. He did not cry. He just stayed still, staring at the air where the pirate had been, feeling the weight of the time given to him. The Straw Hats came running, surrounded him. None of them spoke. None of them asked if he was all right. None of them did anything but kneel beside their silent captain. And for the first time all night, the sky of Elbaf began to clear. The red clouds parted, and a golden light appeared on the horizon. But in his mind, Luffy was not yet entirely free, because Imu was still standing in the gray landscape, holding the last red thread in his left hand. He told him it had been entertaining, that the pirate had been an interesting sacrifice, that he had not expected anyone to be willing to age for him. He told him it didn't matter, that the result was still his, because now Luffy would live the rest of his life with the guilt of Bonnie. He told him that guilt would weigh more than the corruption, that it would eat away at him more slowly but more deeply, making him doubt every time he smiled. But Luffy, in his mind, walked up to him, held his gaze, and told him that guilt was not the same as corruption, because guilt also teaches. He told him he was going to carry Bonnie's sacrifice as a promise, not as a wound, that he was going to walk the rest of his life with that promise. He told him that promise was going to be his new freedom, a freedom that did not give up, a freedom invented every day with every decision to keep going. Imu looked at him, was silent for a long time, and for the first time in 800 years, something like a real emotion passed beneath his eternal black robe. He told him that perhaps Joy Boy had been right in the end, that perhaps the Nika did not break like the others, that it was time to withdraw, and he began to fade, slowly, in the mental landscape, leaving Luffy standing alone in the center of his own head, with the red threads falling to the ground. But before leaving entirely, before letting go of the last red thread, Imu told him one more thing, a seed saved for future dark storms. He told him his mother was going to come for him, told him that when she found him, he would wish he had never known her, that that encounter had been written long before. He told him that the next time they met, it would not be he who would corrupt him, but Luffy's own blood that would finish the work that had been started. And he faded away. He released the last red thread, and Luffy in his mind was completely free, standing in a landscape that was no longer gray, but full of color. In the real world, Luffy lifted his head, looked at the sky clearing over Elbaf, and for the first time in hours, took a deep breath as if it were brand new. His Nakama were kneeling around him, all alive, all wounded, all waiting, none of them daring to speak, none of them daring to break the sacred silence. Zoro was the first to speak, told him in a low voice that he was there, that he had come back, that that night was over, that he could rest easy now. Sanji lit another cigarette with trembling hands and told him he was going to cook the best dinner the ship had ever seen, in honor of Bonnie. Nami came over until she was right next to the captain, sat down on the grass, took one of his hands, and squeezed it softly, without speaking, without needing anything more. Robin placed a hand on Luffy's shoulder, looked at him with that usual calm smile of hers, and whispered that she had heard everything. everything that she knew. Chopper climbed onto Luffy's head, stroked his hair with a hoof, and told him that as the doctor he was going to heal every one of his wounds, no exceptions. Usopp, Frankie, Brook, and Jinbei came over too, forming a circle around the captain, and for the first time in hours, the silence felt like a hug. 3 days passed before any Straw Hat could speak normally again. 3 days where the Sunny stayed anchored in the Elbaf harbor in silence. Luffy did not eat, did not sleep. He just stayed sitting on the figurehead looking at the sea, with the hat resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on the horizon. Loki, who had woken up wounded but alive, came aboard on the 4th day with a barrel of Elbafian sake, the oldest one the giants had stored away. He set it in the center of the deck without speaking, and walked back off slowly, understanding that that crew was still mourning something that did not get mourned quickly. That night, the Straw Hats gathered around the barrel. Brook took out his violin and began to play Bink's Sake, this time all the way through, with no interruptions and no held-back tears. Sanji filled the cups with the giant sake, one for each of them, and left one extra empty cup in the middle of the circle, without explaining anything. Luffy raised his first, looked at his Nakama one by one, and for the first time in 4 days, his eyes held something like the old smile. He told them that a Nika who loses his Nakama stops being Nika, and that night he had come close to stopping being who he had always been. And he told them the first toast would not be for them, would not be for him, would not be for the journey, but for the youngest pirate of the group. He took the empty cup from the middle of the circle, filled it with giant sake to the brim, and walked to the bow of the Sunny under the crescent moon. He looked at the open sea stretching out to the horizon, whispered Bonnie's name into the wind, and poured the contents over the dark waves of Elbaf. The sake fell into the sea, mixed with the salt water, and for a second, in the foam of the wave, something golden shone, like a smile saying goodbye. Luffy promised the sea he would tell her story on every island, that he would find Kuma, that he would give him back the memories of the daughter who had believed in heroes, and he also promised that she would always be in the first drink of every barrel the crew opened, until they reached Laugh Tale together. He went back to the circle. They all raised their cups at the same time, and toasted in silence, clinking the glasses softly, listening to that sound in an endless night. That same night, Luffy stayed alone on the deck of the Sunny, after everyone else had gone to sleep, worn out by the mourning and the sack. He took off his shirt, looked at his chest under the moonlight, and saw for the first time the mark Bonnie had not been able to fully take away. A scar shaped like red threads, thin, small, right at the center of his chest, where Imu had placed his hand to start the corruption that endless night. The scar did not hurt, it did not throb, it did nothing. It was just there, marked on his skin, a permanent reminder of the night he almost lost everything. And for a second, while Luffy was looking at it, the scar glowed red, soft, almost unnoticeable, and went dark again before he could be sure he had seen it. He pulled his shirt back on quickly. He put on his hat, and he stayed there looking at the sea, feeling something that was not fear, but wasn't peace either. It was the promise. It was the new freedom. It was the debt to Bonnie. It was the question of who his mother was and why Imu had smiled when he mentioned her. And it was also the realization that he, Monkey D. Luffy, was stronger than any king on any throne, because he had something kings didn't. He had Nakama. He had shared memories. He had swords broken in his name, and kicks given in his honor, and lightning bolts fired with desperate love for his life. He had the first drink of every future barrel reserved for a pirate who had crumbled in the wind of the sea, to give him back the time he had lost. But far away from there, in the forbidden palace of Pangaea Castle, Imu had taken his seat back on his throne after his first walk in exactly 800 years. The 5 elders entered the chamber, knelt before him, and Saturn, the oldest one, dared to ask whether the operation had been a complete success. Imu did not answer right away. He kept looking at a screen showing the Straw Hats' ship anchored at Elbaf, with everyone alive, with everyone toasting. And for the first time in 800 years, beneath the robe, Imu smiled with something that was not cynicism, but something more like the respect a hunter feels. He whispered that the kid had resisted more than Joy Boy, that the pirate had surprised the entire universe, that night he had learned something new and important. Saturn asked whether they should send another unit to finish the job, but Imu waved a hand under the robe in refusal, without speaking, without explaining. He told the 5 elders that the kid had won that battle, but that the war was only beginning, and there were many ways to break a freedom. He told them the next card was already in play, that Luffy's mother was on her way, that meeting would hurt more than any demonic corruption. Saturn dared to ask who that mother was, what her relationship to the plan was, but Imu only laughed softly, like glass breaking slowly. He told them they would find out, that the whole world would find out, and that when that day came, not even the Nakama would be able to save the Pirate King. And he sat there in silence, watching the screen, watching Luffy laugh with his Nakama on the deck of the Sunny, waiting for the next move on the board. At dawn on the 5th day, Luffy gathered his Nakama on the deck again and brought up from storage the barrel of giant sake that Loki had given them. He placed it in the center of the circle, looked at his crew one by one, and told them that morning they were going to renew the oath they had made at the Barity. But this time, he told them, the oath was going to be different because they were no longer promising to fulfill a dream. They were promising to fulfill a dream they had to invent. He told them the old dream had been planted by Imu 800 years ago, that the old freedom was a carrot for a horse that had been tamed too much, but that now they had something new, a freedom they had not inherited, a freedom invented in the crater of Elbaf with a girl who came apart in the air, a freedom that was built with Nakama, a freedom that did not give up, a freedom that, if Imu tried to erase it, would spring up again on another shore. Luffy put his foot on the barrel first and swore to be the king of the pirates of a new freedom, a freedom he was going to invent on his own. Zoro stepped up next without looking at anyone and swore to be the world's strongest swordsman, not to reach anyone, but to protect that new freedom. Sanji put his leg on the wood, lit a new cigarette, and swore to find the All Blue, not as a goal, but as a harbor where that freedom would anchor. And one by one, Nami, Usopp, Chopper, Robin, Frankie, Brook, and Jinbe stepped on the barrel, each with a new dream, each with a renewed promise. And they left an empty space in the circle, a space where Bonnie should have been, a space that would stay empty until they reached Laugh Tale. When everyone was done swearing, Luffy lifted his face toward the clear sky of Elbaf and shouted into the wind the line that would be his new flag. He shouted that a Nika who loses his Nakama stops being Nika, and that he would do everything he could to never lose them, not even as a demon. His shout swept across the island. The giants heard it from their villages, Loki from his broken palace, and the seabirds carried it westward. That line reached Pangaea Castle, where Imu heard it from his throne, and for the first time in centuries lowered his head with something like doubt. It reached Mary Joise, where Saturn heard it and knew that the original plan was no longer possible, that they were going to have to rewrite everything from the start. It reached the East Blue, where Shanks heard it from the bow of his ship and laughed with that bandit's laugh that came out at important moments. It reached Garp's quarters, where he was sitting in a tavern looking at an old photo, and the retired admiral smiled with tears he did not want to show. It reached a woman on an unmarked ship crossing the Red Line, a woman wearing a black hat and a gaze that looked a lot like Luffy's. The woman heard the shout, lightly touched an old scar on her chest, the same red thread pattern that Luffy was now carrying on his. She smiled with a mix of pride and pain, looked at the horizon where the wind was carrying the echo, and whispered two words her crew had never heard her say. She whispered, "My son." And then, with the steady voice of someone who had made a decision 800 years ago, she added that it was time to go kill him. It was the mother. It was the next storm. It was the next card in the game that Imu had promised to play until the end of the sea, end of known time. But the Pirate King on the deck of the Sunny still knew nothing of that, and was laughing with his Nakama around Bonnie's empty cup. The Sunny set sail that same afternoon, leaving Elbaf behind, leaving the crater behind, leaving Bonnie's dust mixed into the waves forever on that coast. Luffy sat down on the figurehead again with the hat on his head, looking at the horizon as if the horizon had all the missing answers. The red thread scar on his chest glowed once more, just once, softly, and went dark again before any of his Nakama could notice it. Inside his mind, in a forgotten corner of the gray landscape, a small shadow still remained, a shadow Imu had left behind on purpose when he withdrew, a shadow that was going to wait, a shadow that was going to grow slowly, a shadow waiting for the perfect moment to come back on another island, in another sea. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the Pirate King was sailing with his Nakama, with his incomplete crew, with his newly invented freedom. And you, if you had been in Zoro's place, watching your captain turned into a demon, would you have had the strength to raise the sword that same night? If you had been Nami, watching your savior's first fist aimed at your face, would you have closed your eyes or held his gaze until the end? If you had been Bonnie, knowing that aging was going to cost you every year of your life, would you have put your hands on the Sun God Nika's chest? Anyway, drop your answer in the comments, because the next time the sun sets over Elbaf, the Pirate King's mother will already be walking its shores.